Hello, everyone. My name is James Puentes, and welcome to the Southeastern Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Management Network's monthly webinar. For those of you who are new to Southeast RISCC, this network is focused on reducing the joint effects of climate change and invasive species, and we do this by communicating science, sharing knowledge, and identifying and conducting priority research. Most importantly, we want to build a community around these goals. We are a new network, and so our first step in this process is this webinar series, which meets the third Thursday of each month at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'd like to also acknowledge the Southeastern Climate Adaptation Science Center, who is supporting the formation of the network. And I'd also like to say, if you can look in the chat, Dr. Paul Evans has put in a survey link for everyone to fill out once they get the chance in order to make sure that we have any information that could help us with establishing our network. So for today's webinar, I'd like to introduce Dr. Cleo Bertelsmeier. Dr. Cleo is an invasion biologist and myrmecologist. Did I say that right? Awesome. Interested in socio-economic drivers of invasions. She studied biology at the University of Oxford in the UK before moving to the University of Paris 11 in France for her PhD on the impact of climate change on ant invasions. She then worked on mechanistic modeling tools to predict species range dynamics at the University of how do I say that one? Adelaide in Australia. Close enough. Since 2019, she's a professor and group leader at the Department of Ecology and Evolution at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. Dr. Cleo will be presenting her work on globalization and the accidental spread of invasive insects. Dr. Cleo, thank you for joining us today. We are so excited and looking forward to your talk. The virtual floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. Let me see how I can share my screen. Does that work?
Yep, looks good on our end.
Looks okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, so today I will talk about some of my research on globalization and the accidental spread of invasive insects. So, so this is a map of COVID-19 very early on when it started spreading. So we are all a bit tired of seeing maps of COVID, but I thought this one is quite interesting. It was made a few weeks after the virus started spreading. And it's actually really quite coherent with this other map of human flows of planes and transport. And this is quite interesting because biological invasions can really affect human health, and they also can affect environmental health. However, those species who affect human health are regulated by the World Health Organization, which has a binding agreement for member states who have to report if they have a species in the country. And so this is why we get this really interesting data to analyze very early on from the spread of the coronavirus. Now, of course, afterwards, it has been criticized because some states have not reported as well as others. But at least I would really like to point out that this is quite amazing relative to the data that we have on all of the other invasive species that affect environmental health, and there's no internationally legally binding agreement for those other species. Despite the fact that invasive species are really among the biggest threats to global biodiversity, so currently they rank around second after habitat loss, and maybe climate change will catch up soon. Now, I won't do a long introduction on invasive species, of course, given that you're all experts in the field, but maybe only one thing that I would like to mention. So invasive species, of course, are species that have left the native range, that have been moved outside of this range by humans. And this might, of course, occur naturally, such as in 2011, when there was a tsunami that has transported thousands of species from the Japanese coastline around the planet. But this type of events remain relatively rare compared to the all ongoing human-mediated transport of invasive species. So my research and the research of my team really centers on two questions. And one is this introduction stage of the invasion process, and in particular, the impacts of globalization and socioeconomic factors on this introduction stage. And then we're also interested in the establishment of species, and in particular, the impacts of climate change and how species interact with novel environmental conditions or novel communities. So today I will mention a few pieces of research work that we published recently, and I will start with temporal invasion dynamics, and then look at global species flows, emergent introduction pathways, and the resulting biotic homogenization of communities. And I will end with a bit of studies on climatic niche shifts. So first, temporal dynamics. I'm sure you have already seen this type of figure. So this one, it's from a famous paper published a couple of years ago, which shows the number of new records going up over the past 200 years. And when you see this curve, it really looks actually quite scary. And we see this steep rise in new invasion records. Now, one of my PhD students here, Emmerich Bonamour, he said, okay, this is really scary, but what about the observers? So of course, over the course of the last 200 years or so, the number of observers and scientific activities, people collecting data, has also increased. So if we might need to take this into account if we really want to understand to what extent this rise in invasive species is actually driven by socio-economic activities such as trade. And so Emmerich decided to build a null model of species introductions based on the sampling effort over time. So here you can see in red, this line here, it's showing the actually observed new invasion records of insects over time. And in green, this is a null model based on sampling activity of species. And this is for the insects, and we also did this for plants. And you can see in both cases, the null model already explains quite a fair bit of the rise of new records. But then we looked at the difference between the null model and the observed data. And what we found is a pattern of two waves, in fact. So the first wave happened during the 19th century and really coincides with the first wave of globalization, with the development of transportation, international trade. And there's a dip between the 1900s and the Second World War. And then we need to wait until the 1960s until we see the second wave of invasions. And the same was also true for plants. We also see this pattern of two invasion waves. And then we tested if these two invasion waves are coherent with the variation in trade openness. So that's an indicator which measures how much is exchanged among countries relative to what is produced within a country. So how open is the trade, global trade? And this is the data you can see here in gray. And then we did a wavelet analysis to test if indeed this trade openness explained the two waves of invasions, and which was the case. And then Emmerich said, okay, but where do these species invasions occur? And we've seen that both plants and insects follow this pattern of two waves of invasions. But actually, maybe there's a link between plants and insects, because many insects use plants as hosts. So if you look at a map of insect establishments, so this is a map of insect establishments until 2010, and you compare this with a map of plant establishments, well, you would say this does not look so similar. There's quite a few countries where we have striking differences. And so he looked then at the plant invasions from the past, because in many cases you could expect that first the host plant needs to spread before you can have insects feeding, for example, on this plant that can invade afterwards. So if you look at a map from past plant invasions until the year 1900, we can see this already looks much more similar. And so he then did a model looking at the flows of plant and insect flows at incremental models. So plant flows until the year 1800 to 2000. And he found that the plant flows that best explained insect flows of today are those indeed from the past, so about more than 100 years ago. And we also tested if plant flows from the year 1900 explain insect flows better than would trade flows from today, which are often cited as an important factor driving insect invasions. And indeed, once we account for plant flows from the past, trade flows are no longer significant. And based on these models, we then estimated the number of expected insect introductions based on this past plant invasions. So in a way, an invasion depth, which would be only due to the plants, host plants that have already started to be invading and which have not yet seen the insects arriving. So you can see this invasion depth would be particularly important in South America, Africa, and some parts of tropical Asia. Now, what about global species flows in general? So this is a figure from a paper published a couple of years ago, where scientists have started to map this global exchanges among continental regions, thanks to the increase in availability in large data sets. And so here you can see the patterns of observed flows of plant species on the right side. So the way that you have to read these figures is that you see at the outer side, these are the continental regions. And so, for example, if you take Europe here, there's one part which is filled. So this corresponds to species that are native to Europe and which have invaded other regions. And then this part of the chart, which is white, corresponds to species that are native to other regions and which have invaded Europe. And so this on the right side are the patterns of observed species flows of plants. And so the authors of this study have compared those patterns to expected flows of plants. So expected based on what exactly? They are expected based on the native biodiversity of those regions. So basically, if a region is very rich in species, such as South America, then just by chance, you would expect that this species is a donor of many invasive species worldwide. And so then they compared this null model scenario to the flows, observed flows of plants, and they found that old world plants have more frequently invaded the new world than vice versa. And yeah, and then they put forward some hypotheses to why this might be. So maybe this is because they're particularly good invaders. So maybe they share some traits for quick colonization of disturbed habitats. So maybe they have some other pre-adaptation to invade. But so they didn't test this. And in fact, after this initial study of species flows, there were several other studies that have also looked at species flows for other taxonomic groups, such as reptiles, amphibians, ants, and others. And what I found quite interesting is that whatever the species flows that people observe, so this can be quite different. So sometimes it's in old world, it's a larger donor than the new world. Sometimes it's a particular continent. For ants, for example, South America, it's a large donor. But for each taxonomic group, researchers have some particular hypothesis to why this region might harbor species with traits that make them particularly good at invasion. And so I wondered, well, this might be the case indeed, but then alternatively, maybe those patterns of flows could also be explained by the level and directionality of human transport. So maybe some regions are just overrepresented because historically, for a given taxonomic group, they have been, they have had a lot of exports of particularly goods, for example. And so, I wanted to test this idea, and I chose to work on ants. So before going any further, I need to make a little disclaimer about ants. So I'm passionate about ants, and I work a lot on them. So about half of our research in the team is on ants. And here you can see a particularly scary picture of Tapinoma magnum, which has invaded Lausanne in Switzerland, where I work. So just for your information, it was not related to myself that the species has arrived in Lausanne. Yeah, but ants in general are a really cool group to study. So here you can see there's a huge variety in shapes and lifestyles and sizes, ecologies, and so on. And many invasive ants are also very interesting because they form these large super colonies where different nests may cooperate with each other. So here, for example, you have the Argentine ant, which is a famous invader, and they have this huge super colony spanning over 6,000 kilometers from northern Portugal to Italy. That means that you can take ants from Italy and from Portugal, you put them in a box, and they behave exactly as if they came from the same nest. And moreover, ants are really an interesting system to study because we know more than 14,000 of species that have been described, more than 250 introduced ant species, and there's really good data on the distribution of this species. So some of the studies that I will talk about are on ants. And so we decided to work on species flows of ants with Sébastien Ollier, who is a biostatistician. And and we tried to understand species flows to the United States because we have particularly good data for the US and ant species which have established there. So my hypothesis from the beginning was that the species flows to the United States would be simply a consequence of the opportunity to arrive there. And so I expected that because ants are mainly introduced with trade as accidentally transported, I expected that general trade flows would be a very good predictor of ant flows. But I was completely wrong, as you can see on the first chart on the left. So we simplified a bit the way to present the data because I find this flow charts a bit difficult to read. So here you can see in red, these are the flows of ants to the United States. And most of them come from Latin America a little bit from Europe, a little bit from Asia, not much from other continents. And in black below, you can see flows of trade to the United States. And so this is very, very different. So flows of trade, they come a lot from Europe, a lot from Asia, and not so much from Latin America. So that was completely wrong. And then I thought, well, what's going on here? Maybe this is because general trade is too general to represent opportunities to travel for ants. And so we looked at agricultural trade, and this was slightly better fit, but this still contains a lot of commodities that don't transport ants. So what does transport ants? So from interception data, we know that ants travel a lot on plants and fruits. And so if you look at this plant and fruit trade, this really, really fits very well the flows of alien ant species. So if we map this here, the data, the actual data is at the scale of countries. So here you can see on the left side, these are flows to the United States of plants and fruits. And the bubbles are proportional to the amount of trade coming from these different countries. And on the right side, these are the flows of alien ant species established in the United States. So for ants coming to the United States, we found that global flows are well predicted by the opportunity to travel. But you need to take the right type of commodities, so plants and fruits. Okay, so ants are mainly transported accidentally, but so an emergent introduction pathway that's becoming more important is the pet trade, international pet trade. So more and more people are interested by buying exotic species as pets. And so with a postdoc in my lab, Jérôme JP, we decided to have a look at this global pet trade. And here you can see the different taxonomic groups: mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fish. And in the global species pool, this graph shows the proportion of species which are invasive. So, for example, among mammals, 3.6% are considered invasive. And so we asked if invasive species would be overrepresented among species which are sold as pets. And so we compiled different data sets at the global level. And this is what we found. We found that they were very much overrepresented in the trade, in the pet trade. Now, so here you can see that for sometimes we have several pie charts for the same species group, which is because we looked at different data sets, and sometimes these data sets didn't use the same methodology, and so we didn't want to pool the data from these different data sets. But what we found is that whatever the data set we used, we found an overrepresentation of invasive species in the pet trade. Now, why is this the case was our next question. And of course, you could imagine that this is because maybe the pet trade somehow favors invasive species, maybe pet owners, pet sellers select specifically traits which make a species invasive, and that's why we have this overrepresentation. But alternatively, we thought also it could be that these species have been sold for a long time as pets, and so because they have been sold for a long time, maybe the pet trade has created the opportunity to become invasive for this species. And so it's a little bit a chicken and egg sort of question. Yeah, what was first, the introduction and invasion, or was it first the pet trade? And it's a little bit difficult for some of those groups to disentangle the two, because many of these groups have been traded for quite some time. And so we then decided to turn again to our model system, the ants. So because ants, there's an emergent pet trait in ants. And when Jerome first suggested me that we should work on the pet trait in ants, I was very surprised, and I really didn't believe there would be such a thing. And I told him, what, really, there are many crazy people like ourselves who would be interested in buying and selling ant species? And he said, yes, there's a huge online market, in fact, which has developed with the internet. So it's very recent. So since the early 2000s, but really 2010, I would say it really took off. And yes, and this trait includes little colonies with queens and some workers, which are put in a test tube, and you can order them online, or even a whole nest also of ants. And then it's very convenient because, yeah, you can order them online and they are shipped, so the post come to you. And yeah, there's almost no regulation on the trade of ants. Yeah, so you can buy whatever you want. And now we found more than 600 species of ants that you can buy online. And among those species are really some of the worst invasive species. In fact, we found among the worst invasive species, we found several that are sold online, and the sellers even advertise them. You should buy them because they are so easy to keep alive, and they have a great growth rate and so on. So really characteristics that make them invasive. And so we looked a bit at this trade, online trade in ants, using data from online shops. And yeah, and we found there's quite some trade going on among different continents, and it really has started to rise quite steeply in around 2010. And so we used ants to test if there is still an overrepresentation of invasive species in this trade, because this trade is relatively young. And so we don't expect that in the last 10 or 15 years that there are many invasive species that became invasive because of the pet trade. So ants have been found around the planet for a very long time, for more than 150 years. So many of them have really arrived before that. And so we believe it's really good system to test this question. And so we looked at the global species pool and found that about 1.7% of species are considered invasive. And then we looked at the traded species pool and found again a huge overrepresentation of invasive species. And we also found that invasive species are sold by more sellers than non-invasive species. And then we looked if this can be explained by particular characteristics of these ants. So we studied several traits of ants which are known to be linked with invasiveness, such as body size, multiple queens per colony, habitat generalism, nesting generalism, and range size, and tested which of those are linked with commercial success. And we found that habitat generalism and range size are the two which are really predictive of commercial success. Body size, it's a bit a weird one because it goes in opposite ways. So invasiveness is linked to small body size, while commercial success is rather linked to larger body size. So we think that really probably the ease to collect these species, because they are present everywhere in many habitats, and also they're really widespread. This really that increases the availability to the sellers of ants. So from this study, we can conclude that invasive species are overrepresented in the global pet trade. And the pet trade might select for invasive species or species with similar characteristics, favoring invasiveness. So perhaps specifically linked to habitat generalism, for example. And yeah, and so finally also we think that the pet trade has many opportunities for future invasions. Now, so of course, so we have looked at here the global exchanges of invasive species, but what is the result of those invasions? So more and more species established, and so what happens to these communities worldwide? Now, the global communities have been really shaped by the history of the Earth. So here we can see the history of the continents 225 million years ago, and the all continents were still linked together, and then they were breaking up until they formed the Earth as we know it today. And this history of the continents and climates has shaped the biogeographic regions of the world as we know today. So here we have a map published by Holt and colleagues 10 years ago on the update of Wallace's zoographic realms, where they've looked at these bioregions. So bioregions are characterized by abrupt, steep transitions in community composition. So when you come to a regional barrier, you really find a rapid turnover in species composition suddenly. And so we wonder to what extent human movement of species around the planet breaks these natural boundaries, and if perhaps we have new boundaries appearing. So we could imagine, for example, that new regions that are linked to trade flows or trade agreements could leave a fingerprint in this new regions that might appear. So how can you assess these breaking points in species composition? So just to introduce the method very briefly. So if you consider a country, let's take Switzerland, where I work. So this is here, where you see the green dot. And you can look at a list of species that are present in Switzerland. And then on this map, it shows the number of species that Switzerland shares with each other country in the world. So a lot here in the Palearctic, of course. And then, so let's say we consider a pair of countries like Switzerland and France. So they have 136 ant species that they share, that they have in common. And Switzerland has 13, which are unique to Switzerland, and France has 84 that are unique. So based on these three numbers, we can calculate a dissimilarity index, for example, a beta sim index, which ranges from 0 to 1. So if it's complete overlap, it's 0. And if it's completely dissimilar, the index is 1. And so you can calculate this dissimilarity between each pair of polygons on a map. So here, for example, countries. You calculate the dissimilarity. And then you can look in this metrics. You can search for breakpoints where you really have really a transition in composition. So this is something that has been done by Capigna and colleagues in the study in Science a few years ago, where they looked at 175 species of terrestrial gastropods, which had, these are all invasive species, and they are present in these 56 assemblages around the world. And so they looked at the historic bioregions of these species before human-mediated transport and after. And what they found is that before human-mediated transport, these species really fall more or less in clusters that correspond to classical bioregions, while after human-mediated transport, these barriers are more or less erased, and you only find two big clusters. One it's a temperate cluster and one it's a tropical cluster. So this is a quite shocking result, I thought. But one thing that they didn't do is that they didn't look at the impact on native biodiversity. So this is a study which is really, these clusters are based on these 175 introduced species before human-mediated transport and after human-mediated transport. And so what we wondered then is if the transport of this introduced species has the power to also really overcome and change classical bioregions of all native biodiversity. And so to do that, we looked at ant species. So this is Lucy Olus Jacosa, who's also a postdoc in my team. And we looked at all 13,000 and something species of ants, including 292 introduced species. And we had data on 536 assemblages around the world. And so this data set really enables us to look at the impact of introduced ant species, which are a small minority of all ants, on all of native ant biodiversity. So first, we looked at the historic bioregions, so before human-mediated transport of the species, and we found, again, more or less the same classic bioregions as for other taxonomic groups. And then, following human-mediated transport, we have a result which is very similar to the Capinia study on gastropods. So we find a gigantic tropical bioregion, and then some more temperate regions that remain. But there's a huge effect of homogenization, particularly pronounced in the tropics. So if you look at the dissimilarity among communities with distance, we can find that before the movement of non-native species around the planet, we have compositional similarity, which really decreases rapidly with increasing distance. And then you can see this is very much, the image here is very much blurred. So this effect is much weaker after the transport of human-mediated transport of species. Sorry. And then we mapped at a global level. We calculated an index of homogenization, which looks at each polygon individually and calculates the extent to which this polygon has become more similar to all other polygons. So this is a biotic homogenization index that we developed. Yeah. And so here you can see the darker purple it is, the more homogenized these communities have become. And so one thing that's really striking from this figure is that actually most of this homogenization and breaking of biogeographic boundaries is really driven by tropical islands. So these are the ones that have homogenized the most. So this is, of course, due to several things. So first, they harbor less species. So the introduction of a couple of non-native species has a greater impact. Yeah, but they also are really hotspots of ant-invasions. Now I will just touch on a last topic that we are interested in our team. So and that's the establishment of species under novel climates. And so here again is the species that's invasive in Switzerland, in Lausanne, Tapinoma magnum. And we can see here its native range. It's in North Africa, and its introduced range here in Europe. And yeah, and so many of these invasive species encounter novel climatic conditions. And so we looked at the climatic niche of the species with a former postdoc in my lab, Jelena Bujan. And we really found a large niche shift of the species towards colder climates. And this was also accompanied by increased acclimation ability with colder conditions. And so we were interested in looking a bit more generally at climatic niche shifts with Olivia Bates, who was a PhD student, and did analysis of the literature. And here you can see these are the conclusions of studies that we found. So first of all, here you can see the number of species that are studied, and most studies are only on single species. So it's really a bit difficult to conclude something very general about how frequent niche shifts are. And then, strikingly, you can see, okay, some studies conclude there was a shift, and others conclude there was conservatism, but there's also many that are a bit unclear about the conclusions of the study. And then we looked at the metrics that people use to conclude whether there's a niche shift or not. And one metric which is very frequently used is called D-overlap. And so this is the range of values that D-overlap can take when people conclude that there was niche conservatism. And this is the range of values that you can find in the literature when people conclude there is a shift. So of course, like on average, D-overlap was smaller when the species has indeed shifted its climatic niche, which is not surprising, but still we were quite puzzled by the extent of variability in this metric. And similarly, on the right side, you can see, okay, whether or not the study concluded that a high proportion of species shifted. Yes, it varied a little bit, but you can still see studies concluding that conservatism is frequent. It ranges from 0% conserving their niche to a proportion around 30, 35, 40%. While studies that conclude that niche shifts are very frequent, they range also from around 25 to 100%. So there's quite a lot of overlap. So it's sometimes quite subjective what the papers highlight. So if it's a niche shift or conservatism, it really depends a little bit on what the authors want to highlight, and it's also similar with interpretation of some of those metrics. So we decided to look at it a bit on niche shifts in ants and study the whole taxonomic group, and to try to understand the relative amount of these niche shifts, not only the metric itself, whether or not a niche shift is concluded, but rather can we identify species or attributes of species that predict which species would be the most likely to shift the niche. So here you can see examples of two species, and we have the blue areas, it's points from the native range, and red are points from the introduced range. And we looked at the overlap of those climatic niches and also the value of expansion. So expansion is the amount of new climate that is colonized by the species, which is not present in the native niche. And so for some species, like the first one here, we find a high overlap and a very low expansion. And here for this species on the bottom, there's really low overlap between the two niches and very high expansion. Yes, and we actually had the hypothesis before doing the study that probably the best invaders would be those that had the greatest capacity to shift their niche, which sort of makes sense, that they might be the best pioneers of new climates and so on, some greater flexibility. But what we found was in fact the opposite. So here you can see on the upper part of this figure, this is the de-overlap of species which are considered invasive based on their impacts, or alien, which are not considered invasive, but which are established, but with no documented impacts. And so you can see those species with impacts, invasive ones, have a higher niche overlap, so lower niche shift, while those which have no documented impacts have a lower niche overlap, so a higher amount of niche shift. So then we thought, well, but this is maybe because impact-based definitions are not the most useful. And so we used another definition based on the global spread of those species. So we used species in these three groups of regional spreaders, transcontinental spreaders, or species that are really global invaders. And we still found the same result. So those which have spread at a global scale showed the highest niche overlap, so smallest niche shift, and those which show the highest niche shifts are those that are only spreading at the regional level. So this really, quite frankly, puzzled us, this result, and we were really surprised. It was very counterintuitive, and then we thought about this for a while, and thought, oh, but maybe it's because those species that are invasive at the global level and those species that have the highest impacts, maybe those species are also relatively dominant members in their native communities. So maybe they have already filled a lot of their fundamental niche. And because they're so dominant, and because maybe biotic interactions are not so much limiting their ranges, maybe they have already filled a lot of their fundamental niche. And once they get the opportunity to travel because of immediate transport, then there's not much new niche which is left to colonize within this fundamental niche space. While perhaps species which are not so dominant invaders, which are more spreading very originally, maybe those species have a smaller realized native niche, but there's more space to fill the fundamental niche. So then we wanted to test this. And so we looked at the native distribution and native niche size. And here on the left side, you can see we measured the size of the native distribution using an index of spatial diversity. And we found that indeed those here that showed highest expansion of the niche on the right side are those that had a smaller native distribution, smaller geographic distribution. And when we look at the niche size, so we looked at the hypervolume of the native niche size, we found also that those species that showed the highest expansion into novel climates had the smallest niche size. So probably this is really an effect of release of biotic factors, of opportunities, which enables those species to colonize new climates. But on the upper side, so this is relatively positive if your aim is to predict future spread of a very invasive species, because this means that probably if you work with a very invasive species, a very dominant species, this has to a greater extent filled its niche, its fundamental niche, and is less likely to shift the niche. So perhaps it's easier to predict potential distributions of this species. So a few take-home points from this this presentation. So we have seen that the globalization dynamics are linked to the two waves of globalization. We have also seen that flows of species around the world can differ by a taxonomic group and might be likely driven by opportunity. And for some of those flows, it's really necessary to link them with precise trade metrics. So such as for ants, we really need to understand the flows of plants and fruits. We've also seen some new opportunities for species provided by the pet trade. And yeah, and the result of this transport of invasive species around the planet is biotic homogenization and the breaking of classic historic biogeographic boundaries, and it is greatest on islands. And finally, we have seen that niche shifts can be frequent, but they are smaller in the most invasive species. Yes, and with that, I would like to thank my funders and especially these members of my team, and you for listening. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We definitely have time for questions for anyone who would like some questions answered within the Zoom, and then we can also follow up as well. Do you have an email that you could provide them?
Oh, yes,
maybe
sure.
drop it in the chat.
I can put it in the chat. Let me see how this works.
And then the Zoom recording will also be provided for those who are in the listserv. And Dr. Cleo, if you would like to actually go back to that first slide as we go through the questions, just so people can
oh, yes,
sign up.
I can share again. Let me see. Okay. Does this...
Yeah, so anyone who's not on the listserv, feel free to scan that QR code so you can join. And then we definitely have some time for questions. So if anyone would like to ask a question right now, feel free.
Okay, there's someone put a question. Dexter, so well, I might have missed this point, but do ant species differ enough in their diet specificity, generality, such that generalists are likely to be more invasive? Yes, so there are, in fact. It's I did not cover this this point, but in one of our studies, we looked at characteristics which are linked with ant invasions, and it's actually quite interesting because we found different traits were linked to different aspects of invasiveness. So some traits are linked to the probability of being transported, and these are more things like living in association with humans near urban areas, generalism, habitat generalism, nesting generalism, and then other traits are more linked to their local spread and more competition with other species. So things like colony sizes, high number of queens are really important. Are really important to establish dominance at a more local level. So it's, and yeah, so diet generalism is also one of the things that's really important in the innovation process. So I write my email.
So I actually had a question similar to that one. And when all of these ants or any other invasive are going to these different countries due to whatever opportunity that they have. Did you notice any likelihood for any of their parasitoids or any of their predators even coming with them to these different countries?
Oof. Yeah, that's a good question. I think for us it's not so much known yet, but I think it would be really fascinating to see if we have this trickle up effect through the trophic cascade, because we find, okay, plants survive first, and then you need to wait for some time before they start establishing, spreading, and becoming abundant, and then you have the food resource for invading herbivores, insects. But then you can imagine, okay, after the herbivores, maybe you have some specific predators, parasitoids, and so on that could follow the wave of herbivores, insects. Yeah, that would be a really fascinating topic and project to test. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm currently studying Phragmites australis, SPP australis, in the southeast United States. And the insects that we find on there are really interesting, especially
Yeah.
because you see the parasitoids as well as you see the thing that they're eating. So in
Yeah.
the same stems. So it's like that always gets me thinking, like, did they come at the same time, or did the parasitoids establish later, or like how that worked?
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, that's really
Mhm.
interesting. But if people don't have questions now, but think about something later, it's no problem. So I put my email in the chat, and you can contact me anytime, no problem.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming out today, and thank you, Dr. Cleo, for being willing to present today. Yeah, just as Dr. Cleo has just said, feel free to reach out to her over email. Feel free to reach out to any of us if you have any questions regarding the RISC network, or joining the listserv if you had any problems with the QR code or anything. And then if you could please fill out that survey that was at the top of the chat from Paul Evans, that would be really helpful in order to allow us to expand to each other and establish our network even more. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Thank you for coming out today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thanks.
Yes, of course.